Hello, everybody. Back. We are, of course, Committee on Canadian Heritage. We're now studying Bill C-10 in detail for clause by clause to follow. We have a couple more meetings of witnesses. We have a good list of witnesses today, and I want to thank them for coming. Just for the sake of transparency, as colleagues, you notice we had Shaw Communications originally invited. Unfortunately, they weren't able to make it, so we filled in that empty slot. We now have 6 groups of witnesses. They'll get 5 minutes each. So today we have a new format. We're going to go the full 2 hours with all of our witnesses instead of breaking it up 3 in the first hour and 3 in the second hour. There will be a health break in between. If I forget it, please remind me that I've forgotten it. Nevertheless, let's get straight to our witnesses. We have the Alliance of Canadian Cinema, Television, and Radio Artists. That is ACTRA. We have David Sparrow, who's a national president and performer, Marie Kelly, who's the executive director, and Raj Shone, who's a general counsel. We also have BCE Incorporated, Jonathan Daniels, vice president, regulatory law. Alain Strati, who's the Assistant General Counsel. We have from the Canadian Communications Systems Alliance, we have Jay Thompson, Chief Executive Officer. From the Fédération Nationale de Communication et de la Culture, we have Pascal Saint-Ange, who's the President, and Julien Laflamme, Coordinator, Research and Women's Services, Confédération des Syndicats Nationaux. Also from Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, we have Daniel Bernhardt, who's the Executive Director. And also finally, and last but by no means least, from Unifor, we have, I'm not sure Mr. Diaz was able to join us or not, but we had Jerry Diaz, National President, Howard Law, Director, Media and National Representative, and Katha Fortier, who's the Assistant to the National President. Now, before we get into that, I see Mr. Manley has, from the Green Party, has his hand raised. Mr. Manley. Sorry.
I'm having a real hard time hearing you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if other people were having the same problem, but you sound.
I see a few nods, so you seem to be onto something correct. Check 1 2 1 2 check check check. How are we doing? Is that better?
There's an echo.
There's an echo.
You sound like you're miles away.
Ah, yes. That's reflective of many things, but thank you, Mr. Manley.
Mr. Chair, just to note, you're fine on floor. So it's only on the translation channels probably that there's a problem. I hear you loudly and clearly on floor.
All right.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Lewis.
It has something to do with the interpretation, because when I turn the interpretation off, your volume is fine. When I turn the interpretation, set it for, in my case, English, that's when we had problems with echo. So if for on a technical reason, I think it has something to do with interpretation.
I'm assuming right now you're having a hard time hearing me. However, this time it's fine. I'm going to stay on this channel right now. Am I seeing? Nod your head in the affirmative if you can hear me okay. I see. I see a critical mass of nods in favor of hearing me, if I might put it so boldly. That being said, let's proceed. Mr. Manley, you had, was that your intervention?
It was, but if anybody wants to give up a little bit of time for me to ask questions, I'm more than happy to take it. You can email my P9 if you're willing to share time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Everybody heard that, I hope? Okay, great. So now we're going to go straight to our witnesses. You each get up to 5 minutes. I know we have the full 2 hours. I'm going to give you only a little bit of flexibility, so please help us out. From ACTRA, we're going to start with ACTRA first. I need a hand up to see who's going to start. Mr. Sparrow, for up to 5 minutes, please. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chairs, committee members, and staff. My name is David Sparrow. I'm a Canadian performer and the national president of ACTRA, the Alliance of Canadian Cinema, Television, and Radio Artists. Joining me today are Marie Kelly, ACTRA National's Executive Director, and Raj Shone, ACTRA's General Counsel. On behalf of our 27,000 plus professional performer members, we are pleased to appear today before the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage to share our thoughts as part of the committee's study of Bill C-10. We have been following the progress of this bill, and like other industry stakeholders, we want to ensure a strong and vibrant industry for Canadian content, which is why we are pleased to see the proposed legislation will require online undertakings, including foreign services, to contribute to the production and discoverability of Canadian programs. We do, however, have concerns about some of the other proposed changes in the bill and the impact they will have on our industry and, by extension, Canadian performers. I'll pass it over to Marie Kelly, our National Executive Director.
Before any changes are made to the Broadcasting Act, we would first like to acknowledge the existing Act has both served us well and has been remarkably technology neutral. Therefore, we believe any changes to the Act should only be made if they will help better support and uphold the fundamental purpose of the Canadian broadcasting system, which is to ensure Canadians have access to Canadian stories and music, as well as entertainment, information, and news programs. With that said, we feel we must take this opportunity today to sound the alarm about a proposal in the bill that could significantly reduce the requirement to use Canadian creativity and talent, one that would put Canadian stories and storytellers at risk. While production activity in Canada is booming, even following pandemic closures, there is growing concern that opportunities to tell Canadian stories are decreasing and Canadian content production in both English and French is lagging further behind. Recent headline-grabbing announcements of the cancellation of Canadian shows like Frankie Drake Mysteries and Kim's Convenience highlight this problem. While Canada is experiencing growth in the creation of high-quality English language films and television shows, we are seeing a downward trend in the production of Canadian content made by Canadian writers, directors, and performers. CAFCO data suggests the number of Canadian productions declined on average by 12.4% each year between January 2017 and December 2020. The growth we've recently seen in television production in Canada is largely due to higher average spending on the production of television series, not an increase in the number of Canadian shows being produced. Investment in Canadian drama and scripted comedy programs by both private broadcasters and the CBC are also declining. During the recent CBC license renewal process, ACTRA noted CBC English television spending on Canadian drama and comedy programs decreased by 21.2% from 2017 to 2020, even while average cost of production on fiction programs increased. While we welcome foreign production investment, over the long term, we're concerned there will be fewer and fewer opportunities to tell Canadian stories. If we don't create an environment in which Canadian stories and storytellers can continue to thrive, our culture and identity may be lost.
This is why we're gravely concerned with the proposed wording in Section 3(1)(f) of the bill, which removes the requirement for each broadcasting undertaking to make maximum use and in no case less than predominant use of Canadian creative and other resources in the creation and presentation of programming. This change would reduce the requirement to use Canadian creative talent and would devastate our screen-based media production sector. This is an industry that contributes $12.8 billion to our country's GDP and generates 180,000 plus jobs for hardworking Canadians. For myself and my fellow ACTRA members who are already precarious workers, this could lead to a loss of work opportunities for Canadian performers. It is fundamental we retain the principle of maximum but not less than predominant use of Canadian creative and other resources as it applies to Canadian programming. Section 3(1)(f) should read as follows. Each broadcasting undertaking shall make maximum use and in no case less than predominant use of Canadian creative and other resources in the creation and presentation of Canadian programming, and shall contribute significantly to the creation and presentation of Canadian programming to the extent that is appropriate for the nature of the undertaking. Our proposal acknowledges the essential role for Canadian creators and retains the concept of to the extent that is appropriate for the nature of the undertaking, recognizing that all online services will be contributing to the creation of Canadian content. In closing, we would again like to thank you for the opportunity to appear today. We would also like to stress the importance of amending the proposed bill in its current form so it can be implemented as soon as possible. We will look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much. Our next guest will be Bell, BCE Incorporated. And we have Mr. Daniels, Monsieur Stradi. I need a show of hand. Who's going to start? Mr. Daniels, go ahead for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, good morning, and honorable committee members. My name is Jonathan Daniels, and I am Vice President Regulatory Law at BCE. With me virtually today is my colleague Alain Strati, Assistant General Counsel, who I will share my time with in this opening statement. As you may know, Bell operates a variety of broadcasting services across Canada, television, radio, and online, in English such as CTV, and in French such as the recently launched Nouveau Network. We are also a distributor of Canadian programming through 5 TV and satellite TV. We provide critical news and information services, ensuring Canadian voices are represented and heard. We support Canadian talent with contributions to the Canada Media Fund, Factor and Music Action, among others, and through our own Canadian productions. We support Bill C-10 and urge its swift passage into law. It is long overdue. By now, it should be clear that Canadian broadcasters are struggling. Foreign over-the-top providers are thriving in the Canadian market. Over the last 4 years, they grew their Canadian revenues by over $2.4 billion, while at the same time, Canadian broadcasters experienced a drop in revenue of over $1.3 billion. And here's another jaw-dropping statistic. The 3 largest OTT service providers, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+, the latter of whom just launched over a little year ago, already between just the 3 of them have more Canadian subscribers than all of Canada's television viewers combined. Local television and radio are taking the brunt of the impact from foreign competition. In 2019, 70% of our country's private local television stations and 40% of private radio stations had a negative profit. The pandemic has, without a doubt, aggravated the situation. Despite all this, we continue to operate, but do so in a regulatory environment that is outdated and imposes massive obligations on Canadian licensees while completely exempting foreign OTT providers. As a much-needed first step, Bill C-10 corrects this structural imbalance by ensuring that OTT providers financially support Canadian programming. OTT has been granted a free pass for over 10 years. They have not contributed to Canadian content programming while taking away subscription and advertising revenue dollars from Canadian broadcasters. In contrast, Bell Media and Bell TV spend close to $1 billion annually on Canadian programming, either through direct expenditures or contributions to funds like the CMF. However, it is not enough to require OTT to fund Canadian content. As the impact of OTT providers continues to grow and broadcast revenue shrink, the ability of domestic broadcasters to support Canadian content has weakened considerably. We must reduce the regulatory burden on domestic players, which can be achieved at the same time as growing the total expenditures on Canadian content by making the OTT providers contribute their fair share. Alain?
Abordons maintenant les nouvelles et
Now let's talk about news and information. Canadians rely on broadcasters for their local news, but the stations themselves are struggling. In fact, local TV has been unprofitable, and that has been the case every year since 2013. This puts immense pressure on our ability to continue to deliver local news. Bill C-10 does recognize the importance of local news, but it fails to specifically provide financial support to local news. This oversight must be rectified, otherwise we risk losing voices and stories that enhance our Canadian democracy. Consequently, we propose an amendment to the bill that would ensure direct financial support for the production of news programming funded by both OTT and domestic distributors. In conclusion, we support Bill C-10 because it lays the groundwork for a broadcasting system that treats all players fairly and equitably, and it moves us toward a sustainable broadcasting system. Thank you for the opportunity to present our views. A complete list of our proposed amendments have been included in our written submission to the committee. We will be delighted to answer your questions. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
CCSA, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I am Jay Thompson, CEO of the Canadian Communication Systems Alliance, or CCSA. CCSA represents about 100 independent communications companies across the country, which provide bundled TV, internet, and telephone services to Canadians mostly living in smaller communities and rural areas. Our members include, for example, Co-op-Tel in the Estrie region of Quebec, Huron-Tel in southwestern Ontario, and Milk River Cable Club in southern Alberta. CCSA was formed in the early 1990s, around the same time as the current Broadcasting Act came into force. Like the Act back then, our members at the time did not contemplate the growth in size and influence of the foreign digital giants. But also like the Act back then, our members did not contemplate the massive consolidation that would take place in the Canadian broadcasting industry. Neither the Act nor our members contemplated that just 3 domestic companies, Bell, Rogers, and Quebecor, would come to dominate Canada's communications marketplace. That through ownership of most of Canada's TV services and of Canada's largest BDUs, internet, and wireless providers, those 3 companies would become Canada's own vertically integrated domestic giants. In fact, those domestic giants have since become so big and influential that the CRTC recognized that it had a problem, namely that the giants now have both the incentive and ability to engage in anti-competitive behavior that could harm other broadcasters and Canadian consumers. To address that problem, the CRTC has established various safeguards to preclude the domestic giants from favoring themselves in ways that would increase costs and reduce choice for TV consumers. Those consumer safeguards include a code that, among other things, ensures you don't have to subscribe to the giants' unpopular TV channels to get their popular ones. The safeguards also include provisions in the Digital Media Exemption Order that ensure you can subscribe to your internet provider of choice, and not just the giants' internet services, to access the giants' online services like Sportsnet Now and TSN Direct. In its current form, Bill C-10 puts those consumer safeguards at risk. When we first reviewed the bill, our concern was that in focusing on the foreign digital giants, it ignored the growth in size and influence of our domestic giants. We've come to realize, however, that the bill does the exact opposite. Instead of ignoring our domestic giants, it actually embraces them, but not all to the good. Specifically, our concern is that, as written, the bill will enable those giants to favor themselves in ways that will serve to increase costs and reduce choice in our broadcasting system. It will enable them to do exactly what the CRTC warned they would do if left unchecked. Now, much has been said in these hearings about how the bill will level the playing field. That's true. But the field it will level is the one that the field of the giants. It will tilt even further in the giants' favor the other fields in the system, the fields where smaller and independent players go up against those giants. Bill C-10 and the draft direction contemplate imposing regulatory obligations on Netflix and others, and relaxing existing obligations for Canadian broadcasters. Notably, it's the domestic giants that seem to have focused the most on supporting such regulatory relief. It would be easy to assume the relief they seek relates solely to their CanCon spending and exhibition obligations. But make no mistake, they will also aggressively pursue relief from the consumer safeguards the CRTC has imposed on them. This isn't speculation. The giants are already using the courts to challenge the CRTC's jurisdiction to establish and enforce those safeguards. If left as is, Bill C-10 will embolden the giants in their efforts to escape the CRTC's consumer safeguards. To prevent unintended consequences and to protect consumer choice and affordability, particularly in smaller and rural communities, the bill needs to confirm the CRTC's jurisdiction to establish and enforce its safeguards against the giants, including those contained in the Digital Media Exemption Order. We've provided suggested language in our written submission. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Now we go to Fédération Nationale de Communication.
The National Communications and Culture Federation, starting with Ms. Saint-Ange for 5 minutes, please. Good day, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. First of all, thank you very much for allowing me to speak to Bill C-10. My colleague, Sophie Préjean, from the Union des Artistes, couldn't be with us today because she's filming. I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Julien Laflamme. He is with me to help me answer your questions and enrich your reflection. The FNCC, or National Communications and Culture Federation, represents approximately 6,000 members from 80 unions. About 2/3 of our members have evolved with the Broadcasting Act and are working for public and private broadcasters in radio, television, and on digital platforms. The Federation also works in close collaboration with culture unions such as the UDA, GMMQ, and ARQ. Last week, the FNCC and our partners published an unprecedented and very concerning report on the state of the situation for independent workers in the cultural world. Their precarious situation is undermining artists, creators, and cultural artisans, and this has been the case for many decades. Combined with the stopping or the complication of their business because of the pandemic, they are experiencing psychological and financial distress. Of course, the living arts are particularly hard hit by pandemic measures and closures. In 2019, no cultural activities reached the low-income threshold, which was at $24,000 for a single person in Quebec. Not even those of our members working in the film and video sectors. This financial precarity and the weak social safety net for independent workers makes them extremely vulnerable, especially during crises. And therefore, we would ask you to amend Bill C-10 in order to improve conditions and standard of living for our cultural workers. This should be a priority. The truth is that our media ecosystem and audiovisual ecosystem, inaudible for the interpreter. If we wish to continue to set ourselves apart through Canadian productions and through our social fabric, through our values and our diversity, we must ensure that the modernization of our laws continues to protect our cultural sovereignty and continues to allow our content to be showcased. We believe that in improving socioeconomic living standards for our artists, creators, and artisans will help us to have more clout as well in the protection of the French language. To us, it is very clear that the Broadcasting Act is an essential lever to bring value to our language. The amendments regarding the obligation to make use of Canadian workers and artists are unacceptable because they will result in a decrease in opportunities for employment. We must also recognize the existence of foreign digital companies in the broadcasting landscape. In our view, social media should not be excluded from the new bill, but they should be specified, and their business activities should be included in the Act, and the CRTC should be able to regulate them. The CRTC must have adequate and tailored authorities and powers, as well as the necessary resources to implement and enforce obligations and regulations. The regulatory exemption for web giants over the past decades has starkly weakened our cultural and media sectors and its production capacity. Many job losses for producers and Canadian broadcasters. Thank you, Ms. Saint-Ange.
We're just a little over 5 minutes here. We have to move along to our next guest. Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, Mr. Bernhard.
Mr. Chair, honorable committee members, it is a pleasure to be with you today. You already know that Friends is a cross-Canada nonpartisan group that advocates for our members online and on the air.
Original Canadian content in exchange for the right to make billions here. 2, should newer broadcasting formats featuring user-generated content be regulated, not just with respect to the content, but also to the distribution platforms themselves? And 3, how can we ensure a future for Canadian stories and talent when the industry is increasingly dominated by American behemoths? Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, and now the Ministry of Heritage all give the same answer to these questions. Don't worry, just trust us. Everything will be fine. Netflix wants lower obligations than their Canadian competitors, and this bill would in fact allow them to remain entirely unregulated as they are today. Facebook and YouTube say that users are solely responsible for user-generated content, and this bill seemingly agrees, exempting social media, not just for the content, but for any regulation of their distribution infrastructure as well. And what of the need for thriving Canadian media telling local Canadian stories? Well, Bill C-10 removes Canadian ownership as a policy objective and waters down key provisions supporting Canadian talent. Further, it does nothing to reinforce the CBC. Meanwhile, Canadian media continues to bleed. Bell Media has laid off more than 400 people this year, by my counting anyways. Huffington Post shut down its Canada and Quebec operations this month, and Rogers' proposed acquisition of Shaw poses a real risk of further closures. So the question before you is really quite simple. Will you pass the law that Facebook, YouTube, and Netflix want, or are you on Canada's side? If you're on Canada's side, then you cannot trust the department to fix all of the problems that it has created for you. You must fix the bill yourselves. End the ambiguity around whether Netflix and company should contribute less than Canadian broadcasters or not at all. Just write it into the bill, if for no other reason than to put the parliamentary secretary at ease. As you know, her riding is home to Canada's major production facilities, and so for her constituents, lost investment or underinvestment is not actually just a problem of GDP, but actually income taken from their pockets. You must be more involved further because the minister and the department don't appear to properly understand the reality that they are tasked with regulating. Case in point, during his last committee appearance, Minister Guilbeault said that YouTube and the like should not be subject to the Broadcasting Act because government has no place regulating your uncle's cat videos. Minister Guilbeault, have you been on YouTube in the last 10 years? YouTube is full of professional creators with major production budgets, millions of followers, and hundreds of millions of views. In fact, speaking of cats, how about Grumpy Cat, who has more than 12 million followers on social media, has appeared in Cheerios commercials, and has been profiled on all of the major US networks. The UK publication Express estimates that Grumpy Cat, or their owners rather, earned nearly $100 million from these cat videos. That's more than major Hollywood stars. Au même temps, le ministre et Monsieur Ripley.
At the same time, the minister and Mr. Ripley confirmed that Facebook and YouTube were not exempted from the bill and would only be regulated when they act like broadcasters. That statement is extremely misleading. Social media platforms, and in particular YouTube, are broadcasters under the Act. If they weren't, it would not be necessary to give them an exemption.
The promise of additional legislation to combat illegal content online is a complete distraction. What about broadcasting standards or the fair allocation of political advertising space? Discoverability rules or requirements to have French user interfaces. Exempting social media from the Act will make it impossible for the CRTC to address these culturally important issues. So in closing, your task is simple. Ensure a future for Canadian culture. Don't trust the department to just make it all okay after the fact. This is a once in a generation opportunity. And as it stands right now, the bill before you is Facebook's bill. Netflix's CEO told the Canadian press he, quote, loved Bill C-10. YouTube must also be thrilled. So will you pass Silicon Valley's bill, or will you pass a bill that serves Canada's interests? It's up to you to make the right choice, and I'm hoping you will. Thank you.
Okay, now we go to Unifor, and I just need a show of hand. I have who's going to speak on behalf? Oh, I'm not seeing the whole gallery. Nevertheless, I have Mr. Law, Ms. Fortier. I guess I'll allow you to proceed. Oh, Ms. Fortier, I can't see you. Sorry, but I understand you want to start. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Katha Fortier, Assistant to Unifor National President. I bring regrets for Jerry Dias. He had an urgent personal matter today. With me is our Media Director, Howard Law. We have 11,000 members in the media sector, including broadcasting and TV production. Thank you so much for the invitation today. The Broadcasting Act is at the heart of our national mandate for cultural sovereignty. That's something we never stop having to protect and advance, whether it's in trade negotiations or in reform of the Broadcasting Act. For decades, the Broadcasting Act has been a pillar of our cultural sovereignty. The goal is to strike the right balance between Canadian content and our openness to the world. We've weathered this incredible challenge to our cultural sovereignty over the decades. Sometimes these changes have been driven by continental free traders doing the bidding of Hollywood, or by the disruption of new technology. When television arrived in our homes after the war, it didn't destroy radio because we adapted the Broadcasting Act. Cable came along, we adapted again. Satellite TV was supposed to be a Death Star that was going to zap the Canadian media industry, but we didn't let it. Each time, legislators and regulators kept their eye on the ball. We maintained that balance between our sovereignty and our openness to global culture, and we did it in a bipartisan way. Some of the greatest champions of the Broadcasting Act reform were Marcel Massey and Flora MacDonald. Yes, the internet is the most powerful communications technology yet. AI may be the next one, and then there may be another. We must keep adapting. Our cultural sovereignty and surrender is not an option. Unfortunately, for the last 10 years, the federal government and the CRTC have kept their hands in their pockets watching our cultural protections unravel. Now we are doing something about it. We support the amendments put forward by Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, and we especially want to make sure that Canadian ownership rules are reinstated in Section 3. Those rules were ignored by the CRTC for 10 years as it tolerated Netflix setting up shop in Canada under the digital exemption, operating, growing, and dominating as a cultural juggernaut. We propose replace 3(1)(a) with the following. The Canadian broadcasting system should maximize ownership and control by Canadians. We've been following the criticism of the bill, some of its hostility to regulation or hostility to cultural sovereignty, but some of the criticism of the bill is fair. There are loopholes to be closed and policy questions to be answered. We are pleased this committee has asked the minister to answer some of those questions by tabling a draft cabinet directive to the CRTC. Like I said, the bill itself must say that foreign media companies will not be able to buy up domestic media companies, whether conventional or online. Cabinet or the bill should also direct the news broadcasting remain 100% Canadian owned. And above all, Cabinet or the bill must empower the CRTC to dedicate a stream of industry funding for local TV news with strict conditions to tie in to a head count of journalists and media workers. That's missing from the draft directive that has been tabled. Experts and industry leaders appearing before you have already driven this point home. News is the priority cultural good in our broadcasting world. Journalism is essential to democracy. We saw how true that statement was on January 6th, south of the border. We can't afford to be smug about Canadian democracy. Bill C-10 is a generational opportunity to address the underfunding of television news journalism, and we can't miss it. The last thing to say is what Bill C-10 doesn't do, and to be fair, said it would. It does nothing to stem the drain of advertising revenue from all of our media industries, including radio and television, by Google and Facebook. This Parliament has to act on that, and soon. Netflix is just the N in FANG. Bill C-10 must be just the beginning in our defense of our sovereignty. Thank you very much, and Howard and I would be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Madame Vautier. Appreciate that. So now we go to a round of questions. And we're starting with 6-minute questions. And we're going to start with Mr. Reyes. Before we get there, though, I just want to ask, because we have an enlarged group in this particular session, I'm hoping to do 2 full rounds and then have our health break and then come back following that. But I do want to ask my colleagues, MPs, to please direct your question to a person or group to make this go efficiently. And also to our witnesses, if you want to, I ask my colleagues first to be aware of the gallery screen. And that way, if some of the witnesses want to weigh in on a particular question, just put up your hand like this or do it electronically if you wish. But I'm hesitant to interfere myself, so if I'd ask my colleagues to look out for those who want to weigh in on a particular question, please be aware of the screen in front of you. Okay. That being said, Mr. Reyes, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
For 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses with us today. Thank you for helping us with our committee work. My first question will be for Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. So, Mr. Bernhard, the minister, appeared before the committee and insinuated that social media were part of the bill, and I questioned him on that. However, I listened to your speech today, and I look at section 4.1 of the bill that specifies that the bill only applies to users that provide a social media service. And we can think about TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, who invite their users to upload content. Do you have any other examples that you can add, or any explanations to the fact that Bill C-10 does not apply to social media? Yes, well, that is a very important section of the bill. And in our view, it's important to distinguish between users who upload their own content and the platforms themselves, which earn millions of dollars because of their distribution services. So it is a matter of size, in our opinion, and we believe that clear standards must be created to exempt small broadcasters, even small users on YouTube and Facebook, and even other professional services, and guarantee that larger services are not exempted. So a very, very clear structure is required. The wording the minister used was misleading, as I said. These platforms are broadcasters, and that is the reason why the exemption was necessary. When he said that Facebook and YouTube are not exempted, that's something I don't entirely agree with. Well, you and I both agree on that. If Bill C-10 is adopted, the budget of foreign or Canadian online companies would contribute to the Canadian broadcasting system to support Canadian content creators. However, do you think that online foreign companies should be able to ask for funds from cultural funds or from the Canada Media Fund for Canadian content? That is also an important question. In my opinion, the objective must be to create a fair system. So if the system is a system where Netflix and its Canadian competitors are required to contribute similar amounts and have access to the Canadian Media Fund and other funds, and if those funds are also open to Netflix, that is not a huge problem for me. But fair contributions must be made based on size. I have another question for you, and I'd like to put the question to Ms. Saint-Onge at the same time. Do you have specific concerns regarding the powers accorded to the CRTC, given the history of the CRTC's behavior in certain files? I'll start with Ms. Bernhardt and then Ms. Saint-Onge, please. So the situation is unclear, and this concerns me. The minister's directive would give the CRTC a wider range array of options for its regulation. So for us, it's also important to be clear on users, on the funding of original content. That would be clear on the fact that over a certain size, you must contribute a certain amount. It appears to me that no one wants to say, you're going to pay, you're going to contribute. The government wants for the CRTC to make the decision. The CRTC wants the government to make the decision, and in the end, no one makes the decision. So not in a minister's directive, but directly in the law, it must be specified that those contributions must be made. Thank you, Mr. Bernard. I would really like to give Ms. Saint-Onge the opportunity to comment. We received the directive, the decree, and there isn't really any relevant information in it. Ms. Saint-Onge? Yes, well, it's something that concerns us more than in the past because the CRTC was able to determine the list of licenses. So we are concerned that the CRTC would be able to fulfill that mandate, and we're worried about the way it would enforce that new task. We would like to see an obligation for the CRTC to present a roadmap very soon in the coming months so that we can be clear on how it will behave. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ms. Ian, for 6 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I want to start with ACTRA and Mr. Sparrow. Mr. Sparrow, you indicated that you are a performer. Can you tell us what you do?
Well, I've had a extremely fortunate career over the last 30 years, been in over 100 film and television roles and commercials and voiceovers and cartoons and all kinds of things. I've also been a writer and had a couple of projects made. And so I have made my career in the arts for 30 years.
And I want to tap into that insight just a little bit. And if you could maybe just provide us some insight into your world right now and what things might look like if the changes that you propose aren't implemented.
Well, I think it's actually obviously a world that impacts performers, and performers are in some respects the most precarious workers in the industry, in that we aren't guaranteed the work that we do. We, in essence, apply for jobs every single day by auditioning, and sometimes we get those jobs and sometimes we don't. But it's important to note that, you know, a typical performer's income in Canada, even an ACTRA member, a union member, is approximately $11,000 a year. And yet many of our performers obviously make significantly more than that, some less than that. It's a challenging career. But what I look at in terms of this is not just a performer problem, it's an industry problem. And as we look at the changes that are being suggested within the legislation and within the comments that are being sent on to the CRTC, then we risk the basically the shift in what is Canadian content and what flexibilities will be given in terms of that, and therefore what kind of jobs, et cetera, will exist into the future. I think that, Mr. Bernard stated it quite eloquently that this current government has a great opportunity to set the stage for the next 20 or 30 years of Canadian broadcasting, and also of how we're going to provide a cultural legacy for the generations to come.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sparrow. Want to go to Bell now, and Mr. Daniels, if I might right now. You talked about news and the fact that this bill doesn't provide financial support for local news. You're talking about Canadian content. How do you define that? How do you define Canadian stories?
Well, I think I'm going to hand it off in a second to my colleague, Mr. Strati, to discuss about what we can put. But in terms of defining, there's a very important difference between news, what we're talking about, as opposed to Canadian productions and CanCon, because there are strict rules on how CanCon is produced. And the foreign providers, the OTT providers, they may be investing in Canada, but they're not producing CanCon. They're not making any productions that meet the criteria of the CRTC or the CMF. And like many of the colleagues that I heard speak today, I think if we're going to have something to go forward, we have to ensure that that's the case for those providers. So in terms of defining Canadian content and so on, there are rules set out about that. And I note that in the direction, there may be some tweaks to it that the CRTC would have to consider, and we'll look at and participate with the CRTC in that regard. But news, if you're talking about defining news, that's something that's already done by the CRTC. There are funds, and I don't know, maybe Mr. Strati can, Elaine, if you could just elaborate on that aspect, because that's something very easy to define and has been the case already.
Well, it actually, go ahead, Mr. Strati, and then I'll get back.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was focusing in on the CanCon first, because I will note that Bell, has laid off hundreds of people who are responsible for Canadian content in this country. In full disclosure, I was an employee for years. And so this is something that is concerning. If we're concerned about Canadian content and Canadian content producers, and jobs are being lost, I'm just trying to balance the two.
Yeah, listen, I think we're all concerned. I think what we're seeing here is that in the broadcast industry, the traditional domestic broadcasters, they're seeing declines in advertising and so on. And so we've had to make, difficult decisions that are necessary to adopt to the transforming media industry. But at the same time, I think what this bill enables to do is to have more money come into the system generally. There's a lot more money. I think the ministers talked about $830 million. We have similar predictions by 2023 that can come into the system to promote Canadian content, as long as we have rules around making Canadian content, and so it can grow in terms of the amount of production that's done, all at the same time as leveling the playing field and making sure that Canadians, that the existing domestic broadcasters who are seeing decline revenues and seeing a competitive threat are able to basically have more streamlined rules and compete on a level playing field with the OTT providers. And we see this bill as achieving that.
Thanks so much, Mr. Daniels. Mr. Strati, did you want a moment?
I would just add, I think that looking at the COVID-19 last year sort of heightened sort of the concerns that we have in terms of the sustainability model, especially for local news. Viewership has gone up 15 to 20%, and revenue has gone down. So it's really a framework and a need for the financial model which is failing. So a change in that framework and specifically directing the CRTC, I think will give better sustainability, because the interest is there. It's just that the model itself, based on advertising, is difficult.
Thank you very much. Mr. Champoux, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Champoux, for 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to begin by asking a question to Ms. Saint-Onge. Once again, Ms. Saint-Ange, I'm very pleased to have you with us today. I have a question concerning your worry and your federation's worry and the worry of your members on the survival and the health of the cultural sector, especially the Francophone sector and the sector in Quebec in your case. A few days ago, I'm sure you saw the draft published by the minister. I would like to have your opinion on that. Did that draft of the directive reassure you if Bill C-10 were to be adopted? Well, first, in the directive, French is mentioned. However, in the Act, only 2 official languages is the wording used. That is positive. However, in our opinion, there could have been more regarding the production of French language content. For example, that a significant part of funding be attributed to Francophone production, because we're seeing that Francophone productions are underfinanced compared to English productions, so that must be rectified. We think that the directive is an improvement next to the bill, but the law itself must also be modified to show the importance of French. Is there anything else in that draft that you would like to comment on that stood out for you? Yes, I'm not sure if my colleague Julien Laflamme would perhaps like to take that question. Yes, certainly. We have a similar worry regarding the way the bill is worded. For example, there's one section that makes us think that it could cause the CRTC to start a race to the bottom when it comes to regulatory obligations. It's in the wording. The wording is vague, and there are not many parts of the bill that are specific on robust obligations. So I believe the wording must be strengthened in the directive and in the bill. So you think that given that the bill hasn't been revised the Act hasn't been revised in decades, it could be worded more strongly. Exactly. I have a question for Mr. Bernhard with Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. We've often heard you mention algorithms. In the minister's proposed directive, I would like you to draw your attention to point 5B regarding the CRTC and methodology. 5B says that methodology must be informed by data collected by broadcasting entities. And I know that you are very skeptical when it comes to online platforms and the algorithms used by social media. I'd like to hear you on that, Mr. Bernhard, please. You are correct that I am very skeptical regarding social media companies and other tech giants. Since 2014, when Netflix first went before the CRTC, and they fought in front of the cameras, and still today, the CRTC is looking, and we are looking for a way to regulate Netflix. These online entities use algorithms. And there are many parts of the Broadcasting Act that mention decisions made by broadcasters, decisions regarding programming or advertising standards, and so forth. Algorithms must be clearly included in the law to say that companies will be responsible for the choices of those algorithms. And that is not the case currently, Mr. Bernhard. So is it correct that currently companies are not responsible for the algorithms? It's not clear. For example, the choice of programming may or may not mean that algorithms are included, but it's very important. When we talk about including social media and user-generated content on platforms like YouTube, among others, unintelligible for the interpreter. Do you have any comment on regulations? For example, freedom being given to hosts and to artists. Do you think that something similar could be done as is done in the community, at the community level? Yes, when it comes to small broadcasters, there should be certain obligations, but for larger broadcasters, those obligations should be more strict. We're talking about platforms where users upload their own content. Mr. Bernhard, so considering the size is very important. Thank you very much.
We're just past the time. Before I go to Ms. McPherson, I want to, time is just flying along. We're having so much fun. As the fact that we're almost up to an hour, so I mentioned 2 rounds. How about we do 1 round, and then we go to our health break for just a few minutes following Ms. McPherson's questioning. Ms. McPherson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for joining us this morning. I think I'd like to start with a few questions to our colleagues with Unifor. You spoke about Section 3.1a and the wording that you are proposing. As we know, the Bill C-10 removes the first objective of the broadcasting policy for Canada, set out in Section 3.1a. The Canadian broadcasting system shall be effectively owned and controlled by Canadians, and you've put forward a modification that the Canadian broadcasting system should maximize ownership and control by Canadians. Can you comment further on why you think it's so important to have that changed to the Act? And then I think I'll go to ACTRA afterwards and get some clarification from them on the same point, so they can prepare now.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Howard Law, our media director, to take that question. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. The reason why we've suggested an amendment as opposed to a repeal of the section is that obviously the section needs to be modified if it's to recognize and take into account the reality of the foreign streamers being part of the system. But to repeal it outright is a very dangerous thing to do, we think. And we've proposed the same amendment, by the way, as Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. So maybe we're both onto something here. But the explanation that was given by Mr. Ripley and also by the minister in their previous appearances in front of the committee was that it's okay because we have a cabinet directive from 1997 which establishes Canadian ownership, and so we can repeal this section. And respectfully, we disagree, and I have to say we're alarmed that this might happen. And the reason for this is that the directive from 1997 really was passed in order to parse out what Canadian ownership meant in terms of percentage of control of public companies, whether it was a 2/3 ownership requirement or a 4/5 ownership requirement. And the deep concern that we have is that not only could a future government have a change of mind and repeal that cabinet directive, but that in a court proceeding, it's quite possible that a litigant would challenge Canadian ownership on the basis of there being no enabling section in the Act to authorize it in the first place, and that the cabinet directive was frankly invalid or unenforceable. So I think that everybody's on the same page in terms of what they want in terms of Canadian ownership. We just have to make sure that we don't accidentally repeal the governing provision in the Act.
And weaken it unintentionally or intentionally, as the case may be.
Absolutely.
Excuse me. Mr. Sparrow, did you have any comments on that? I know that you've also spoken quite a bit about this, and I'm just wondering if you feel that the need for such prescriptive language as maximum is required.
Well, I do. I think that we are a sovereign country with unique stories. We live in a competitive world, and we've always maintained the airports in Canada belong to Canadians, and that we allow for companies, whether they be domestic or foreign, to use those airwaves by paying into the system and the like, and therefore it's mandatory, quite frankly, that we continue to own those and that Canadians own those. Perhaps our National Executive Director, Marie Kelly, has more to add on that.
Ms. Kelly?
Yeah, I would just say, we've got a history here in Canada for protecting ourselves, whether it's through the regulatory system for broadcast or whether it's trade, because we have the big American country to the south of us. So we've had to be very cautious about protecting our Canadian content. We believe that we need to keep the protections as they exist today for Canadian content, for Canadian broadcasters. We don't want to see it watered down. We see the system as not a perfect system. We're concerned about change. We welcome the change on the one hand because we believe we need to have the change and we need to cover the OTT, but we're concerned that any change not down the regulations that require for Canadian content, for Canadian producers and writers and Canadian actors to be telling the Canadian story. And I would just say that when I think about this issue, and I'm talking to a number of our representatives at the House of Commons, I think about your job. Your job is to govern Canada, but you're also the image that we portray to the globe. It's the values that you portrayed. It's the work that you do that open up what Canada is to the rest of the world. Well, our members do that each and every day. It's the stories that they portray. It's the stories that are told here in Canada that provide a global audience for who Canadians are. What do we value? What do we believe in? What is our life like? What are our stories? And it's so important to keep those uniquely Canadian and that we not allow them to be either watered down or changed because we haven't done what we should do in protecting the system that is done so well in protecting Canada in this global environment.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. And I know that you've spoken about the importance of particularly Canadian writers telling our stories, the Canadians that are telling those stories and how important that is. So I do appreciate that as well. Now, Mr. Law, you had said that your amendment was very similar to that of Mr. Bernhard. So perhaps, Mr. Bernhard, I could pass to you. I know I only have a few seconds left, but if you had anything else you wanted to add on Canadian content very quickly.
Just to add that, yes, we want to make room for the foreign players to increase choice and reflect the fact that they're already here. We don't need to invite them to take over the existing infrastructure and dominate it. If there is a takeover bid, for example, of certain Canadian broadcasters and Canadian ownership is not a policy objective in the Act, on what basis, for example, would the CRTC say, no, this is not okay? And we know there have been Canadian broadcasters, Shaw, tried to sell its share in Chorus recently and was unable to find a buyer. And so if we open it up, they may be able to sell them, but is that a desirable outcome for the country?
Thank you, Mr. Bernard.
The statement is exactly right, what Unifor and ACTRA said, and we support them in this regard.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to have to be very strict about this break. However, I want to get back as soon as we can. Please, 5 minutes for a health break, and then we'll start right away. So we'll now suspend for 5 minutes. Okay, everyone, welcome back. This is C10 with the new format, which seems to be going just well. We just finished our first round. We're on to our second round now, where the times slightly change. We now switch to 5 minutes. We're going to start with Mr. Waugh. Mr. Waugh, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to start with Mr. Thompson. Thank you for your 2 amendments. Do you have any faith in the CRTC? Let's start there, because we're heavily regulated. We've heard that throughout this whole C10 debate. So are you comfortable with the CRTC taking on more work?
Well, like any other member of the industry, we're not big fans of overregulation, and we do have some concerns about the amount of regulation that our smaller cable members are currently subject to. But what we're seeking here is maintenance of existing powers and confirmation of existing jurisdiction that are critical to ensure that consumers have affordable broadcasting services and choice in accessing the channels that they want. So it's a balance that needs to be struck. We've had our challenges. Unless these issues are addressed, we fear that we're going to have many more challenges going forward.
You deal mostly in rural Canada. Do you do any newscasts, or do you have any community channels in your areas?
We have almost 20 of our members that offer some form of a community channel. Some of them in the very smallest systems are just alphanumeric billboards, but we have other communities such as Access that serves Regina and lots of Saskatchewan that has a very strong, active community channel that's very popular in the community, very important source for access to local news and local programming.
Yes, Access is very successful in this province. I would like to ask BCE. Last week, the National Football League signed massive TV agreements with NBC, CBS, Fox, but also streaming with ESPN Plus, which is owned by Disney, Peacock, which is owned by NBC, Paramount, which is owned by CBS. And then you have Amazon, exclusive streaming rights to the Thursday night NFL game, $1 billion. I think when I was reading newspapers in the United States today, they pretty well said that everything is going to streaming. And the NFL and sports usually is the leader. And I think we saw that last week when the NFL made the agreements with the streaming companies. Your thoughts on that and how it would play here in Canada, where you, Bell, for an example, you could put the CFL on streaming if you so choose. So, streaming is going to be the big thing we can see in the next 4 or 5 years here.
Sure. I mean, streaming is extremely important, and it's a competitive market out there in terms of buying the rights between us and any OTT provider and so on. So if you look at, this is another reason in our mind that it's important to level the playing field and to make sure that we actually have the opportunity and under the same rules as we compete with anyone else, or because we're going to be buying the rights and trying to buy the rights, so let me put it that way, and competing with foreign streamers as well as Canadian streamers and broadcasters. And our approach has been basically to put both on streaming and as well on our major networks as well. So and it allows us to sort of innovate in that, bring it together. We just launched, in fact, when you watch a Montreal Canadian hockey game, we just launched this as a TSN app that you can get different angles and so on by using the app. So there's different advantages, but that's tying it to us as both as a broadcaster. And what we need to make sure is that we have the ability as a broadcaster or a streamer or whatever, that we're operating on the same level playing field as anyone else who can buy the rights, and that we compete equally with these foreign providers.
I think the public would say to you, prime time on CTV 7 to 10, you buy American programming during prime time. Canadian content, very few shows are showing up on CTV. We get the simulcast with the American channels and the reality shows. How can, and I'm looking to ACTRA because they're a part of this, where primetime Canadian television series are few and far between from the hours of 7 and 10 at night. So, Mr. Daniels, can you work with Canadians in giving us more Canadian programming in primetime television instead of offbeat times?
Well, I'll start by saying I don't think the answer is more prescriptive rules about the time of when you have to showcase or something like that. Because as the reality is that we're competing with Netflixes of the world and so on, to take traditional approach and say, let's worry about the prime time specifically, and have certain obligations that are on different providers to show CanCon or something like that, I think is going to be self-defeating. What really matters is that you get more money into the system, and that you allow from that more money into the system that everyone is able to produce the best content, the thing that makes the most business sense for them.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Sorry, I have to cut it off there. I apologize. We're over. Just as a point of clarification, I know we tend to use in the business, we tend to use a lot of acronyms, and Mr. Daniels and others have said the word OTT. For the people who are listening from the outside in, that's over the top, which is one of the original terms for streaming services, just so we don't get confused by some of the acronyms. Nevertheless, Mr. Lewis, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to begin my questioning with ACTRA. Well, and due to your guidance now, I will say the Alliance of Canadian Cinema, Television, and Radio Artists instead of ACTRA. So I appreciate that, and acronyms are a fast learning curve here in Ottawa. So I would like to talk about how you're saying you're welcoming foreign investment, but we do need to tell our stories. And in the previous hour, you mentioned the history of protecting our Canadian culture, and how important it is to support our writers, our actors, all the workers in those sectors. We see it in all of our writings, the local productions, how much that helps to tell our stories, also how much it helps the Canadian economy. So can you expand on right now the work that members of ACTRA are already doing, working for the digital giants, and some of the shows, and the relationship you have with them now, and how you are hoping that will change in the future with this legislation?
Well, as a union of professional performers, we have a great relationship with the Netflixes and Disneys and other big streaming services that are up here doing foreign service work. That is, they're producing their own productions written largely by Americans. And right now, during COVID, especially because Canada has a better reputation on our ability to handle the virus on our sets, there's a lot of work going on. But we shouldn't be fooled by the fact that once COVID is under control, and once America starts to open up in places like Atlanta, which is really the #2 production center in North America, is able once again to host these productions, that many of them will choose to leave and go back to the United States in order to support their homegrown business. That said, they're here because we have terrific crews, we have terrific actors, and we have terrific post-production. And so they're investing in Canada because it makes sense financially. Where the downfall comes is they're not producing Canadian content. So Canadian writers are not working on those shows unless those writers have moved to Los Angeles and are pursuing careers in a different country. We also are not getting those unique Canadian stories told, and so we're not providing or building up the culture, if you will, of Canada and helping to tell our story to the world. And when we are doing that, let's just point it out. We're killing it in terms of the shows we are doing. Shows like Murdoch Mysteries and others that are shown around the world. Shows like Corner Gas and Kim's Convenience. And it's interesting to see how popular those shows are when we do make the proper investment in them. That Netflix steps in and makes deals to put them on Netflix in order to attract even more eyeballs. But the point being is that if we weaken what is CanCon, if we weaken the use of Canadian writers actually telling Canadian stories, then we are going to feel that pain well into the future. And so we have to make the rules now and the regulations now that will best support that industry going forward.
And can I just add for a second that, you know what, we have to realize that the work that we produce here in Canada, the body of work is every bit as good as any other product from any other country. And all I need to say is Schitt's Creek for us to recognize as Canadians, right, the value of the work that we do. The problem is if we don't support it, if we don't make sure it's on primetime viewing, if Canadians don't see it, if the world doesn't see it, then it will be perceived as not being as the same standard as others. But if we promote it the way other countries promote their content, then it will be world renowned like Schitt's Creek.
So then it's a matter of promotion as well as protecting the Canadian stories. Is that, would you say that's equal parts of it? Is that part of it is just promoting our stories as well?
Well, it's certainly the case. Sorry, Marie, is that our friends at BCE have pointed out the lack of a level playing field as one of those things. Is that creating Canadian production has been one thing in the past, but there's been no money left over to actually promote it in the same way that a Law and Order or similar bought from the US will get promoted. And that's what's really been the challenge in terms of getting things into prime time, is that it's actually less expensive for our friends at BCE to buy a Law and Order and just rerun it in essence in Canada than it is to create a Canadian program. But part of that is leveling that playing field. And I'd just like to speak just real briefly to leveling the playing field. Is we don't do that by weakening the regulations that our Canadian and domestic producers follow. We strengthen bringing the same regulations to the over-the-top streamers and the others and make them play the same game that we're playing here in Canada, which is promoting Canadian culture.
Thank you, Mr. Sparrow. Mr. Lewis, Monsieur Champoux, pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I have a question for the Bell witnesses, and Mr. Pelado recently testified. And following his testimony, and he said that this committee was trying to regulate what cannot be regulated because he was talking about the giants. So do you agree with that statement by Mr. Pelado? And do you think that it is possible to regulate the digital giants all the while maintaining a competitive environment for Canadian broadcasters?
Go ahead, one second. I just need to stop the time for 1 second. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Mr. Lewis.
Je suis désolé.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Make sure
I see others.
Is his interpretation coming through? The interpreter is using the right channel. The interpreter is using the right channel. Can you get the interpreting?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask the interpreter to keep.
The interpreter is speaking at the moment, and he's using the right channel that he was using a moment ago. I see somebody motioning, saying that this is not the right channel. What is not the right channel? Is the chair hearing the interpreter? That is you are. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. That's very reassuring. Because that's the channel I've been using all the time since the beginning of Mr. Champoux's questioning. That is unfortunate. Unfortunately, yes, and that is unfortunate. And the interpreter regrets the situation.
Minutes left, Monsieur Champoux. So we'll get back to you when.
Je pourrais reprendre puisqu'ils n'ont pas entendu la question. Je pourrais reprendre mon temps au complet, j'imagine, à ce moment-là.
I do hope, Chair, that I will have my full time restated since they didn't hear my question. Thank you.
Okay, can we ask the interpreter to check again?
Let's check again the English channel.
In full, which I...
Yes, this has been conveyed to the chair. Mr. Yeah, the interpreter has already conveyed to the chair that Mr. Champoux would like to have his full-time reinstated.
And what I'm hearing. Okay, great.
Tout le monde entend ça.
Monsieur Champoux.
Mr. Champoux, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the beginning, thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, my question is for the Bell's delegation. A few days ago, Quebec's chairman, President Mr. Pelado, testified, and he said to the media that the bill and the committee was attempting to regulate what cannot be regulated. So I'd like to ask Mr. Daniels if you agree with such a statement by Mr. Pelado, and do you think that will be able to have legislation that will regulate the giants and also put the Canadian industry in a really competitive situation? Was that heard by the chair? Thank you, sir.
I appreciate getting the, now that I understand the question, I apologize for my lack of French. What I'd say is, no, we don't agree. The short of it is that we think that leveling the playing field by having foreign providers having to contribute into funds like the CMF, and then the CMF can decide how to pay that money out, will ensure that you achieve CanCon and you get that Canadian, sorry, I'm using an acronym in that, Canadian content production. And so we think that that's the much more effective way that it can be brought in. You can bring them into a system to have a level playing field. Where I do agree is that there is a bunch of rules that can be streamlined as we bring them in and have greater flexibility to allow everyone to specialize and compete into different areas rather than making us all have to do exactly and dictate everything that we have to do today. But I do believe that we can achieve by bringing the foreign providers in, by making them contribute to the system. Quite simply, if they have to pay money into a fund like the CMF, they are going to make sure that they get pulling that money out. That's how companies work. If you have to pay into something, you're going to benefit by pulling out. And that, we believe, is the kind of model that you can achieve.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il me reste quelques secondes pour poser la même question?
I'd like to ask the same question to friends from Amis de la Radiodiffusion, friends from broadcasting. Mr. Bernard.
Bell, that Mr. Pelado's comments are not accurate. We believe that these foreign streaming services can and should be regulated. And I would just say we've been having this discussion since 2014, and we're still having this discussion. And meanwhile, technology has advanced. We are not talking about all kinds of other activity that is happening in the media ecosystem because we're stuck deciding whether or not Netflix should pay. This is the simplest of all the questions. We should just go forward with it.
Thank you, Mr. Bernhardt. Ms. McPherson, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to just take a look a little bit at some of the local news. As many people have pointed out, I, like many of those people, have some serious concerns about the current and future implications on local news. So I'd like to talk to the Unifor folks, if I could, about their proposal. So I know that they're supportive of a local news fund, that they have talked about a larger amount being allocated. If they could please comment on what they would be proposing for that.
Again, I'll ask Howard to respond. He's been working closely with this. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you, Ms. McPherson, for the question. Earlier in the proceedings, Mr. Strati from Bell remarked that the business model supporting local news has been failing. It has failed. Collectively, the major broadcasters have lost an average of 8%, had an 8% loss margin for the last 8 years, and it's not getting better. It's going to get worse. And we've had layoffs. We've had less news coverage. We are in a state of total crisis in terms of local news. So that's just a fact. In terms of what we're proposing for, has probably been an advocate for better funding for local news. The CRTC back in the early teens, after the financial crisis, instituted for 3 years something called the Local Programming Improvement Fund, LPIF, which put up basically an emergency fund of $100 million per year for broadcasting, for local news. And what we're proposing is something similar, but as a permanent feature of the
the ecosystem. As we advocated, local news is the priority cultural good in the broadcasting system, and it's the most underfunded. And so, given that there will be, by the minister's estimate, up to $800 million a year as an injection into the broadcasting system, which is shrinking, of course, the pie is shrinking, but this will greatly increase it. There is room, in our view, to dedicate a steady, sufficient stream of funding to local news that would be available not just to independent television stations now through a very small fund, but to all of the local news operations in the country, so that we won't lose this essential feature of our Canadian broadcasting system.
Thank you very much. We're now going to go to Mr. Shields for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can start with Bell first, in the sense that we know that news does not make money. Advertising makes money. Advertising supports the news. So when the federal government is spending 80% of its taxpayer-funded advertising in foreign big companies outside of Canada, if that money was spent in our own country, because it's advertising that makes the news work, your response to that, Mr. Daniel?
Of course, we would of course encourage everyone that we think that we provide a great product, and we do, and we would support and would like to have advertising on it. I think maybe Alain, you could talk a little bit more about what's going on with news in terms of the revenues right now. But I mean, we certainly would welcome any and every opportunity to provide good or bring in the viewership to news.
Well, when you're saying that, you're saying is you would like taxpayers' money to support news. What I'm suggesting is, why aren't you asking for that 80% money that the federal government of taxpayers is now spending with federal money to foreign? Why aren't you asking for that 80% rather than asking for more money to support local news?
I think all we're saying is, my reference actually there was to advertising on our network, but rather than the news fund. So I would just put it in that we are wish to be attractive in terms of the product to bring eyeballs and so on, and we do successfully, as you heard. We've seen our viewership in news go up, but because of the nature of what's going on in the market, just generally in terms of advertising and more directed, that it has been, that the dollars haven't followed through in that area. And that's, we still believe we have a very viable or attractive, I shouldn't say, rather than attractive product for advertisers.
Yep, got that. But you're asking for more taxpayers' money when you've lost taxpayers' money going somewhere else. So going down to Unifor.
Just to be clear, we're not asking for any.
I've only had so much time. Thanks. You've asked for it. So, Mr. Unifor, we go down there. And you're also asking for taxpayers' money to support it. So we've got 80% of the federal advertising dollars now going to foreign giants. And you're looking for more taxpayers' money to support local news. Now, it's advertising that supports local news. Why aren't you advocating for the federal taxpayers' money being spent in local advertising?
Well, Mr. Shields, it's not taxpayer money that we're proposing to go to local news. It's industry contributions from all the broadcasters, foreign or otherwise. So I think point.
But the point is 80% of the federal government money is going to international foreign giants advertising rather than being spent. So in my local riding, the local media is really suffering, and it's the advertising that pays for that local media. So why wouldn't you be pushing for that as well?
Oh, and we have, sir. Dollars. And we have, sir. We have.
But you didn't mention it today.
Sorry.
So what are you actually doing then?
In terms of our proposal today, I hope I made it as clear as I could.
No, I got that clear. But you said you are working on the 80%, lobbying for that 80% of federal dollars. I haven't heard that today. What are you doing to do that?
We'll certainly send along our previous materials to you, sir. To the extent that you've raised this point and it's been discussed, I think the minister addressed it in his previous appearance before the committee that the government was starting to turn around the direction it had taken on spending most likely too much money advertising in Google and Facebook, and I was going to look at redirecting to Canadian publications, and that's good news. I hope they follow through. And I guess you'd have to address any further questions you could to the minister on that.
But I'm addressing it to you as you represent people who work in local media, and it's the advertising that pays for those people. So are you lobbying? I know what the minister said, but are you lobbying for that change as well?
Well, probably in terms of what our emphasis in lobbying has been, and I guess we haven't been loud enough about it, is that the government really needs to move very quickly from this bill to the next bill that they've promised, which is a bill modeled on the Australian model or otherwise that will see Google and Facebook make a significant contribution to Canadian journalism. And we're hoping that the government and the committee,
I've got that point.
Thank you.
Support that.
And I think
Thank
we have to wrap that point up there. Thank you, Mr. Shields. Mr. Housefather, 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who are with us today. I'm very pleased that Ms. Saint-Onge had the opportunity to reappear without any technical difficulties today.
And Mr. Daniels, I'm not here to beat up on a corporation. I used to be the general counsel of a multinational before I was elected. But I think Canadians are a bit puzzled. BC took $122 million at least from the wage subsidy. BC paid out dividends last year on a quarterly basis. And yet Bell Media cut 200 jobs of local journalists in February. And some of those cuts, as I understand it, were done in a quite heartless way, where people were informed after a public announcement, people were informed during a radio commercial. And of course, for those communities that suffered, CJAD Montreal, the main English-speaking radio station in Montreal being a prime example, we lost local content, regardless of how you claim that the television journalists will now substitute. So I guess I'm questioning, you're asking today, and I understand that, for less regulation with respect to broadcasters, not to give too many powers directly to the CRTC to specifically govern your actions, don't make it more restrictive. And yet, how do you reconcile that with how Canadians feel when they see cuts of local journalism right at a time that your company is both paying dividends and accepting subsidies from the federal government?
So let me break that down into a couple of different things, because you covered a lot there. So the first point, in terms of the reference to receiving subsidies for, and I think you're referring there to the CEWS funding that we received last year. And so I just want to be clear that we took that money strictly for its intended purpose, which was ensuring continued employment for workers in business segments that were extraordinarily impacted by COVID-19, like The Source and Bell Media, for example. And so what that CEWS and the funding did, it enabled us to avoid job losses that would have happened without the CEWS funding. Now, let me come back to the question that you're specifically saying, well, but what about at Bell Media? Because there were some losses this year at Bell Media. So we had to take certain actions that were necessary to adopt to our transforming media landscape. And I think you've heard a lot about what's going on in broadcasting and talked about it in terms of the reductions of revenues. And so we had to take actions to basically streamline our organization. But these changes were needed even before COVID happened. And so what you saw is that they didn't happen last year because we were able to take the CEWS funding. So I think the CEWS funding actually achieved its purpose in that regard by no losses last year. But for us to say and to come to you and say, oh, there's going to be no impact because of that funding for all time or in future, as we have to right-size our business, because we're facing all of these competitive pressures that we just talked about. You heard about the declining revenue streams, both on the broadcasting side, the BD side. We're seeing it everywhere going down. And so when you say you come before us and we're asking you to streamline regulation, that's right. But let's be clear, we're talking about proposals that would reduce the amount of funding that we'd have to make only as at the same time as that you grow the whole pie to be bigger. And so that you enable us to be able to compete and have a business model that's more sustainable, because it's not sustainable under the existing regime.
I do understand. I just think that it's a question of how Canadians perceive things, and I think that the cuts came at quite an unfortunate time. I'd like to go to now the Alliance, and thank you for telling me it's not ACTRA, the right acronym anymore. I wanted to get into the concern that you have with 31F. Could you please just give me succinctly the major concern of, why 31F should remain as is?
Well, definitely to support CanCon and to not water it down. But let me pass it over to our General Counsel, Raj Shone, to get into the minutiae of that. Raj?
Sure, thanks, David. We think it's absolutely crucial to maintain the principle of maximum but not less than predominant use of Canadian creative and other resources. In our view, the language presently contained in Bill C-10 is simply too weak, and long-term will only result in a degradation of truly Canadian content in the system. Our proposed language, which we understand is also supported by the Writers Guild of Canada, the Directors Guild of Canada, as well as the Canadian Media Producers Association, ensures that Canadian programming in the system will make maximum but not less than predominant use of Canadian creative and other resources. For everything that's not Canadian, the regulator can discuss a lighter standard, but it's important that Bill C-10 holds a hard line with respect to the Canadian content produced by traditional or online undertakings. And that standard has been the same and that standard should be the same as it's been for the last 30 years, maximum but not less than predominant use. And that's the standard we hold to.
Merci, Mr. le Président. Do I have any time left?
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Housefather. Time is up. We're now going to go to Mr. Aitchison. We're on to our third round. Something we seldom say at this committee. We're off to our third round. Mr. Aitchison, for 5 minutes, please. Sorry, Mr. Aitchison, you might be on mute. I can't.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I apologize for that. My question is actually for the folks from BCE. I'm wondering if you could speak to the role that the traditional method of broadcasting will play 5 years from now. It seems to me as though that the traditional mediums of broadcasting are fading because of streamers. Mr. Waugh pointed out that sports are moving to the streaming giants. The regulations that we have in place right now for the traditional broadcasters, will they make any difference in 5-10 years from now?
I think you're absolutely right. As we look at and things are changing in terms of what the model is going to look like in a few years, and that's a couple of things that we're trying to achieve in this by getting a level playing field and being able to compete with the streamers. And let's be clear, we're a streamer ourselves, right? We have to move into that, and the way we transact and do that, but to have a whole bunch of historical anachronistic rules about regulatory rules that require us to do it have been we think those are the kinds of things that need to change as you look forward and deal with it and reflect the market reality that we're going to be competing with streamers for the rights to a whole bunch of sporting events and so on, whatever the future is going to be. And I don't have a perfect crystal ball to tell you what that is, but that's also why at the same time our other key message is there's going to be an impact on local news, and that's why there needs to be special funding. And the way to do that is just by taken the money that's contributed into the system and direct, especially some of that new money, to that, to make sure that all broadcasters, both radio and television, have access to be able to provide professional journalism on the kind that really matters to Canadians.
Could you speak for a second about local news? We've talked a lot about the threat that local news is under. It's real. There's no question about that. Is there something precluding local news from being streamed on streaming services?
No, I don't think so. But I mean, maybe I can hand over to Alain to elaborate on what's going on with local news.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that precludes that, but the issue with local news is not visibility or interest or, in fact, viewership. Viewership for local news is quite strong. The issue is really the financial model. Before we were talking about an advertiser, the issue is advertising, and there's only one source of revenue that sustains and supports local stations and local news. What there needs to be is a dual source of advertising, because money and resources are shifting from advertising to subscription or local news. The problem is the revenue. And we've talked about the COVID-19 impact. The problem is when you have declining advertising revenue and you have a seismic shock that has happened when advertising dropped 40% in Q2 of 2020 overnight with COVID, is how do you bring that back up to levels before? So it really is about that the model's not working for local news, but it's the financial model. And we've been trying to resolve that issue for quite some time. And it needs to happen. We've talked a little bit quickly about the NFL. The NFL deal has a lot in it for broadcasters as well, on NBC, on Fox, on CBS, and all the other broadcasters. So it's a mix of different platforms. People do watch live television. It's just now there's mixed viewing, mixed opportunities, linear, non-linear. It's a new consumer behavior.
So what if instead of taxpayers' dollars funding local news, it was a requirement for streamers to carry local news as well, and then they would generate revenue from subscription services?
Yeah, let me take that one. What I would say on that is, I think we want to get away from, first of all, I don't think the answer is to turn to streamers such as the Netflixes of the world and look at them to be our local news providers telling Canadian, because they're going to be foreign owned. They're not going to be focused on Canadian stories.
No, sorry, I'm actually thinking specifically about Canadian streamers. You've identified BCE as a streamer as well.
Right. And so I would see, but rather than dictating and adding extra obligations on us, I would say if you provide the funding, and let me be clear, there's no proposal here to have taxpayer dollars. What we're talking about, we all have to contribute there's obligations that we have to do. And we think that the existing money and new money coming into the system can be redirected partially to do that by taking the OTT providers, the Netflixes of the world, and saying contribute into a system and some of that. But if we start turning around and saying, oh, you want to be a Canadian streamer where you're going to have the following obligations, but a foreign streamer that you compete with doesn't have that, I think that would be problematic.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Aitchison. I have to leave it at that. Okay. 5 minutes is up. Ms. De Bruzen, for 5 minutes, please. Sorry, Ms. De Bruzen, we can barely hear you. Oh, your mic needs to come down.
That's right. I apologize. So if I can begin with the artists formerly known as ACTRA, I was going to ask the question, at some point during the debate in the House of Commons, there was a pointing out of the fact that an idea that there's a lot of employment in different regions in the film sector, and that service industry had a value, it seemed over and above Canadian content, or at least equal. I was wondering what you might want to say to that, because some of the response that I heard was, what's the issue? In my community, I have films that are being filmed right now, right here in my community, creating a lot of jobs, including for a certain number of Canadians. And I'd like you to have an opportunity to respond to those comments.
Well, thank you for that question. And I think that we welcome the foreign service work that is coming to Canada right now. And frankly, it's been coming to Canada in this kind of volume for the last couple of 3 years, as it's become a financial boon for those streaming services that were super hungry for content. And then it's even been doubled through COVID, where it was recognized that they didn't have enough content when people were home 20 hours a day and able to watch it. And so they are eager to produce content. They're choosing Canada as a location, and it's bringing lots of job opportunities and money. But as I said before, when COVID is over, that's likely to change to some degree. When they find that things are getting too expensive for one reason or another, they're likely to ramp up, especially post-COVID, in South Africa and Australia and other places where they were doing work previous to COVID. But all that to say is that it doesn't take away from our responsibility to support the Canadian production and the Canadian stories. And we can do that through a number of means, but certainly this bill goes far by saying it's time for over-the-tops to contribute. It's time for them to follow the same rules we have for our domestic broadcasters, to create actual Canadian content, make it discoverable on their platform, the same way they're doing in many countries around the world. Many other countries have not been shy about saying, no, you're going to have to produce something in our language and something that supports our culture. And so you've got France and Australia and others that put in metrics for companies like Netflix, and Netflix has not had a problem with it.
Thank you. And the next question, I would like Mr. Sparrow, if you could comment, mais aussi Madame Saint-Onge.
And Madame Saint-Onge, if you could provide your comments as well.
That your union, Mr. Sparrow, has worked a lot on diversity and inclusion, how to make sure that we have better representation of Black actors, Indigenous actors in the field. I'm wondering what are the opportunities within this bill, C10, to better support that inclusion and those opportunities? And do you see, do you have any ideas in that respect? Madame Saint-Onge.
And Madame Saint-Onge, if you have any ideas as well.
And so I'll be brief so that Madame Saint-Onge can speak. But absolutely, we've been in conversations, for instance, with the funding bodies themselves, like the CMF and Telefilm, to actually put in rules that will allow for productions that can, in essence, prove that they are more diverse in the way they've come about, or in their production teams, or in their casting, for them to receive funding. And I know that those conversations are ongoing. And I think the CRTC could well establish those types of rules as well, that would better support the wide diversity within Canada of peoples, including our Indigenous communities, and ensuring that they too are able to tell Canadian stories.
To echo what my colleague just said, currently, in the current order, there are incentives. The CRTC could introduce incentives to encourage diversity. However, rather than incentives, it seems to me it would be more effective to talk about obligations. There are more teeth, and it's clear with respect to the obligation to foster diversity.
Time do I have?
Sorry, you have 6 seconds.
That's what I was thinking. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce. Folks, just looking at the time, we have, it looks like this is going to have to be the last round as we get closer to 1 o'clock Eastern time. So I have one question left from the Bloc Québécois. I have one final question left from Ms. McPherson. But if I look at the lineup, and perhaps if you indulge me for just a few moments, the only member with us right now that has not asked a question is Madame Bessette. So, since we will fall short of 1 o'clock Eastern after both the Bloc and the NDP, I thought it would be nice to give Madame Bessette a chance, and then we can say that everybody has had a chance to ask a question. I'm okay. Ms. McPherson, yes, go ahead, please.
The only thing I would just ask is if it would be also possible for us to include Mr. Manley, because he has also not had an opportunity to ask a question.
I was thinking about that as well, but Mr. Manley has left, I believe. I got a note from him earlier. He had to leave.
And that won't work.
But thank you for intervening. That's very generous of you. So, seeing that, let's go to now, Mr. Champoux or Madame Desbiens?
Madame Desbiens, Monsieur le Président.
Oui, oui.
Ms. Desbiens. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Champoux, for giving me your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair and witnesses. Ms. Saint-Onge, given that we understand that French is currently weakened in the context of what you were saying a little bit earlier, that French-speaking artists seem to be more vulnerable. It seems that our artists are having a very difficult time. So I'd like you to tell us about discoverable content in C10 for French language content. Yes, well, indeed, there is no specific formula on how to expand discoverability. Currently, the system requires that productions become more discoverable. We'll say, well, if a production is good, it will be discoverable. However, we know that that's not how things happen on platforms, given that the content that is suggested based on algorithms that are not transparent and on which we have no control. So in order to improve discoverability, the legislation would have to have some sort of discoverability parameters, and it's currently not the case. I'll give you a concrete example. M'entends-tu, a Télé-Québec production, is on Netflix. However, the title only appears in English, and it's called Can You Hear Me? However, it's a French-speaking production, so it's very difficult for the French-speaking audience to find it. So this is the kind of thing that would change the ability for Canadians to find Canadian content. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madame Saint-Onge. Now over to Mr. Bernard, Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. After C10, there will be a copyright law. And would it not be important to focus on that aspect of things as well, copyright? I won't speak to bills that are yet to be written. However, we always talk about upcoming bills, for instance, to ensure that journalism is paid for by the Big Four. Now, the current bill is the only one we have to look at, so I wouldn't want to criticize a bill that's not yet in existence. I think we need to focus on improving this current bill.
Ms. McPherson, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you know, we did have the minister join us earlier on as we were examining Bill C10, and I was concerned, as I know many people were, that when he told us that Facebook and YouTube were not exempt from Bill C10. So I'm just going to give my last 2.5 minutes, if I could, to Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. Could you talk about what you think of the Minister of Heritage's answer that Facebook and YouTube are not exempt from Bill C10?
When I heard that statement, I was prompted to pull my hair out, but as you can see, there's not much left to extract. So I had to express my frustration in other ways. As I said, this is a very misleading statement. For the minister to say that companies like Facebook and YouTube are not exempt, they'll just only be regulated when they, quote, behave as broadcasters, is very misleading because, as I said in my opening remarks, if they were not behaving like broadcasters, then there would be no need for the exemption in the first place. So they are broadcasters according to the law. The question, of course, is how do we regulate this properly? And so our view is very, very simple. Remove this exemption for social media, remove all that. Instead, just say, if you're too small, you will not be regulated. And if you're bigger, you will be. And that leaves it open for new formats to emerge. It means that if you're Grumpy Cat, maybe there's certain standards or applications that will apply to you, but not to Mr. Guilbeault's uncle with his cat videos, which we presume are not very well viewed by the minister's comments. So for him to say that they are not covered by the law is that they are not exempt from the law is extremely misleading. 4.1 clearly says that they are exempted from the law, and we have to ensure that not just the content is governed, but also the infrastructure. Should it be in French? Are there rules about discoverability? What about emergency alerts? So I found the minister's answer unsatisfying and hope that the committee will improve the bill in the ways that I just mentioned.
Ms. you're on mute.
Sorry about that. For my very last question, I will go back to Unifor and just get a little bit more clarity on that fund to support local news. First of all, could you talk a little bit about whether or not you think that 830 million would be, how much of that should be going towards to fund local content, and which agencies should be responsible for distributing that?
Well, the injection of up to $800 million into the system was something that the minister suggested, and other commentators have said he's probably in the right ballpark. That growing of the overall pie of industry broadcaster distribution contributions is obviously going to be divided up in a number of ways. It could include local news, and that would be administered by the CRTC.
Thank you, Mr. Law. Sorry, I have to stop you right there. Madame Bessette to finish, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
I'll start with ACTRA. The committee often heard during its study that protecting artists is essential for the competitiveness of the industry in Canada. How could we protect copyright for Canadian artists?
You may have heard in the past when we've deputed about copyright specifically that while audio performers have copyright protection, audiovisual performers do not have copyright protection. And so that means that when I do a performance and somebody in a foreign country is using my image and my performance in order to make money, it doesn't necessarily flow that I am able to seek compensation for that because we have not protected audiovisual artists for that. And so this is a very important thing for us to continue to fight for in the future and to get Canada to put those types of protections for audiovisual artists into the Copyright Act.
Thank you very much. Ma prochaine question est pour Madame Kelly.
Ms. Kelly, you told my colleague, well, I'd like to know, do you have examples of what other countries, including the US, have done to promote their original content?
Yeah, we can get you more examples specifically of how the original content is promoted. There's other countries. I would say the BBC has done a really good job in Great Britain on doing this. But there are, it's not usually the US that is promoting it in that way because they are the larger entity that has the well-known sort of system. The only thing I would actually throw into this that we haven't talked about is a star system, and a star system promotes individual artists, individual actors, so that, they are the draw towards the movies. And the US does this extremely well, as do other countries. And we don't even have a star system here in Canada that could highlight individuals who are actors who would then bring in the work towards them.
Thank you. Ma dernière question, Monsieur le Président, ce sera pour Madame Saint-Onge.
My question will be from Madame Saint-Onge. You mentioned point 5.8 regarding French content, French language content. Is this the right direction, what is proposed? I'm sorry, but I think the connection isn't good enough for me to hear you from French to French this time. Yeah, oh no, the power is back, so let me use it. You mentioned that you'd like to have some funding which would be given to French language content at your point 5B. And so funding could be given to the promotion of French language content. Is this going in the right direction? Yes, it is going in the right direction. Now you have to define what adequate, how adequate that could be. Because if we base ourselves only on the proportion represented by French population, then the money available for this production will be less for French production, with the consequences on working conditions, which will deteriorate for French-speaking people and workers. So we need to better define what we define as adequate.
I apologize. We a little bit over time. I have to deal with one other thing too for budgetary reasons. But before we do that, I want to say thank you, a huge thank you to our guests who came here today from the Alliance. I can leave it at that, right? Of Canadian cinema, television, radio artists, David Sparrow, Marie Kelly, Raj Shone, thank you so much. From BCE, Jonathan Daniels and Alain Stradi. Canadian Communication Systems Alliance, Jay Thompson. Fédération Nationale de Communication de la Culture, thank you to Pascal Saint-Ange, Julien Laflamme. And Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, Daniel Bernhardt. And finally, Unifor, thank you to Howard Law and Katha Fortier. Give our best to Mr. Diaz. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Before we adjourn, folks, I have a little bit of work we have to do. As you know, we're in relation to the study, relations between Facebook and the federal government. We have a budget here of $1,500 that we need to pass for the equipment that is needed in order to do that meeting. So, do I see approval of this budget for that particular study? Does anyone disagree with it? Hearing no dissension, approved. Thank you so much, everyone. We will see you on the 26th on Friday. Meeting adjourned.